Forget what you know. The people who lived through the Great Depression mastered survival skills we've completely forgotten. I've dug up 20 of the most harsh and effective ones. Number 7 literally saved families from starvation. Hit subscribe so you don't miss these life-changing lessons. Let's dive in. If there was one motto that captured the spirit of the Great Depression, it was this: use it up, wear out, make it do, or do without. It wasn't just a clever saying. It was survival condensed into a single sentence. Families repeated it like scripture because they had no other choice. Every shirt, every potato, every scrap of cloth or paper, none of it could be wasted. That kind of discipline built a mindset we barely recognize today, a way of living where resilience was the only real currency. And the truth is, their world forced them into it. But our world? It's softer, easier, and dangerously forgetful. We've traded resilience for convenience, and in doing so, we've lost something essential. Think about how quickly we upgrade our phones, toss out last season's clothes, or order food because cooking feels like a hassle. That's not how our grandparents thought. In their world, a torn sock wasn't garbage. It was patched and repatched until it couldn't hold together anymore. A meal wasn't judged by how fancy it looked, but by whether it filled hungry stomachs for another night. When luxuries vanish, you discover how little you truly need. And that's the first harsh lesson, learning to do without. Doing without isn't glamorous. It doesn't make for a feel-good social media post. It's the kind of discipline that leaves you uncomfortable, sometimes embarrassed, often envious of those who still have more. Imagine being a child in 1932, walking to school without shoes because your family couldn't afford them. Imagine stretching a bag of flour for weeks, baking bread that grew thinner and thinner until you could taste the sacrifice in every bite. Doing without meant cutting deep in convenience. It meant swallowing pride, enduring scarcity, and finding dignity not in what you owned, but in how you endured. The uncomfortable truth is, we're not ready for that today. Most of us panic when our Wi-Fi cuts out for an hour. We call it suffering when our favorite brand is sold out. But here's the shift. If you can relearn the strength of doing without, you reclaim power that modern life has stolen from you. You stop being a hostage to every trend, every shiny object dangled in front of you. You become untouchable, not because you have more, but because you've proven to yourself you can live with less. That's a kind of wealth inflation can't touch, and markets can't destroy. But there's a second, equally harsh lesson that goes hand in hand with this: delayed gratification. In the Depression, families didn't dream about quick fixes or easy gains. They learned patience the hard way. Every dollar was stretched, every decision measured not by today's comfort, but tomorrow's survival. If you had 2 eggs, you might eat one now and save the other for breakfast tomorrow. If you had a few coins, you didn't splurge, you saved, because tomorrow's hunger was always louder than today's craving. Compare that to now. We live in a culture that tells us you deserve it every time we scroll through feed or walk past a store window. Credit cards whisper, "Why wait?" Delivery apps promise everything instantly. And yet, this instant gratification leaves us weaker, not stronger. The people of the Great Depression couldn't afford those illusions. They knew that waiting, delaying, even suffering was a form of protection. It was how you ensured that when the real storm came, you weren't left empty-handed. And here's the truth. Delaying gratification isn't about punishment. It's about building a future self that thanks you instead of cursing you. When you train yourself to wait, to hold back, to sacrifice now, you're planting seeds that grow into resilience later. That's what families in the Depression understood. Every act of restraint was a shield against uncertainty. Every choice to hold back today was an investment in the possibility of surviving tomorrow. So here's the question. What would happen if you brought that mindset into your own life? If you stopped chasing every upgrade, every impulse, every fleeting craving, and started living by the motto that carried entire families through the hardest decade of the 20th century? Maybe it feels harsh, maybe even unfair, but harsh is exactly what made them strong. And it's strength, not comfort, that carries you through when the bottom falls out. Food, in the Great Depression, was not just fuel. It was a very difference between hope and despair, between a family sitting together around a modest table or a mother quietly skipping her meal so her children could eat. if money was scarce. Food was scarcer, and the kitchen became the battlefield where survival was either won or lost. Imagine it. Every pot, every garden patch, every scrap of food carried the weight of survival. There were no supermarkets to bail you out, no delivery apps to bring dinner to your door. If you didn't find a way to feed yourself, you simply didn't eat. That's the third harsh survival lesson: grow or starve. Families turned backyards, front yards, even window boxes into plots of sustenance. Every inch of soil mattered. Victory gardens weren't just wartime slogans. They were lifelines. Potatoes sprouted in barrels. Beans climbed makeshift poles, and corn lined alleyways. Even city dwellers carved out tiny patches of soil or kept chickens in the backyard, because if you couldn't grow food, you were one bad break away from hunger. Now think about today. How much of our survival depends on long supply chains, trucks, and supermarkets filled with abundance? It feels safe until it isn't. What would happen if those shelves emptied tomorrow? Would we even know where to begin? That's why this lesson stings. Food security was not outsourced. It was personal responsibility, and families who ignored that truth paid the price. But growing was only the first battle. Once food made it to the kitchen, the question became how to stretch it. That's the fourth survival lesson. Stretch every meal until there's nothing left to stretch. Soups were the universal answer. Cheap, filling, forgiving. A single ham bone might flavor pot after pot of beans. A handful of vegetables could transform into stew, bulked up with potatoes or dumplings. Beans and potatoes were staples not because people loved them, but because they filled empty stomachs at the lowest cost. Picture a mother carefully slicing one potato into paper-thin pieces, not for flavor, but so the family felt like there was more on the plate. Contrast that with today, when we toss leftovers without a second thought. In the Depression, stretching food wasn't just thrifty, it was the only way to survive. If you didn't learn how to transform scraps into meals, hunger reminded you quickly. And yet stretching wasn't enough. Even in seasons of relative abundance, there was a looming shadow. Winter. That's the fifth lesson, and it's one of the most sobering. Preserve food like your life depends on it, because it does. Canning jars lined shelves like soldiers in formation, each one a promise that tomorrow there would still be something to eat. Families dried apples, smoked meat, salted fish, and stacked root cellars with potatoes, carrots, and onions. Every summer afternoon spent sweating in a kitchen over boiling jars was really a hedge against starvation in January. If you didn't prepare ahead, winter punished you. Today, we rely on refrigeration and constant resupply. But imagine opening a cupboard in February and seeing nothing but bare wood. Depression families didn't imagine it. They lived it. And the disciplined preservation was a thin thread that kept them alive. But even after growing, stretching, and preserving, another law ruled every kitchen: waste nothing. That's the sixth lesson, and it may be the hardest for us to swallow, because waste defines so much of modern life. During the Depression, waste was unforgivable. Bacon grease was saved to flavor vegetables. Bread, too stale to chew, became bread pudding. Bones were boiled until every ounce of flavor was leached into broth. Leftover coffee was used in baking. Potato peels fried for a snack, and wilted vegetables found their way into soups. The Depression kitchen was an alchemy of transformation, where scraps we'd discard without hesitation became meals that kept families alive. Today, we throw away up to 40% of our food. Can you feel the sting of that contrast? They wasted nothing because they couldn't afford to. We waste nearly everything because we can, which mindset will serve us better if hard times come again. And finally, there's a seventh lesson, the one that shocks modern ears. Meat was a luxury. Families learned to stretch the tiniest bit of meat with fillers: oats, beans, breadcrumbs, and bread slices, because the alternative was no meat at all. A pound of beef might become a dozen meals once it was mixed with beans or stretched into casseroles. Fried chicken was rare enough that it became synonymous with Sunday gatherings. Imagine children eating gravy with bread and feeling lucky because the gravy had been made from a few scraps of meat. For many, protein came not from steak, but from beans and eggs. The idea of eating meat daily was unimaginable. And here's the pivot. Today, most of us eat more meat in a week than Depression families did in months. But when supply chains wobble, when prices rise, what happens to a diet that depends on abundance? That's why this lesson lingers. What feels normal today may be the greatest fragility of all. When you weave these lessons together, you see the pattern. Food was not something people consumed mindlessly. It was grown, stretched, preserved, and honored. Waste was not tolerated, and luxury was redefined. It wasn't about organic labels, trendy diets, or gourmet experiences. Food was survival, stripped to its essence. The Depression taught families that hunger is the cruelest teacher, and that only resilience, creativity, and discipline could silence it. So ask yourself, what's in your pantry right now? Could it stretch? Could it last? Could you waste nothing and still feel fed? Most of us couldn't. That's why these lessons matter. Not as history, but as a mirror. They remind us that comfort can vanish overnight, but resourcefulness never expires. If you learn to treat food the way Depression families did, with respect, discipline, and ingenuity, you don't just eat, you survive. Clothing and shelter weren't fashion statements during the Great Depression. They were shields against the elements, lifelines that stood between families and suffering. Think about it. When you can't afford to replace what you own, every thread, every stitch, every patch becomes sacred. People didn't open a closet full of options. They opened a drawer and prayed that what was inside could last another season. That was the quiet reality millions endured, and it forced them to treat clothing and shelter as survival tools, not disposable goods. The first harsh lesson is simple, but brutal: mend or freeze. Imagine a child's only winter coat with holes at the elbows, fabric worn thin until the wind cut straight through. A new coat wasn't an option, not when money was rationed between food and rent. So, parents became tailors. They learned to darn socks until the heels looked like patchwork art, to sew buttons back on with mismatched thread, to patch jackets with scraps from an old pillowcase. Clothing wasn't replaced, it was repaired again and again. And while some might see that as a sign of poverty, it was actually a badge of endurance. Every stitch was a declaration that we will not give in to the cold. When you hold that mindset, suddenly the smallest act of repair transforms into an act of power. Today, we throw away a shirt because of a tiny tear. Back then, that tear was just the beginning of a story, the story of resilience stitched by hand. But survival didn't stop with patching. The next lesson was a hand-me-down economy, a system where clothes didn't belong to individuals but to entire families, even neighborhoods. A coat could start its life on the oldest child, make its way down through 3 siblings, and still get loaned to a cousin down the street. Pants were hemmed shorter for the younger ones, shoes stuffed with newspaper to fit smaller feet. Pride had to be swallowed, because vanity couldn't compete with survival. If you were lucky enough to outgrow something, it meant you were still alive, still growing, and your clothes had another chapter left to serve. In a way, this created an invisible bond within communities. Everyone wore each other's history on their backs. The jacket you wore to school might have carried the warmth of 2 neighbors before you, and you passed that same warmth forward. Clothes weren't possessions. They were a communal investment in survival. And then came scraps, the forgotten fragments of fabric that were never treated as trash. People learned to turn rags into warmth, quilting together pieces, so worn out they barely held their color. A quilt wasn't a decorative heirloom in that era. It was a difference between a family shivering through the night or waking with strength to face another day. Nothing was too small to matter. A torn flour sack became a child's dress. An old curtain found new life as a skirt. Even scraps of wool too tiny to sew into garments were layered and stitched into blankets, insulating families against brutal winters. That ingenuity wasn't just about resourcefulness. It was about dignity. In making something new out of fragments, people reclaimed control in a world that constantly threatened to strip them bare. Every repurposed rag whispered, "We are not finished yet." And here's the deeper truth. These practices weren't only about fabric and thread. They were about identity. A patched coat didn't just keep you warm. It reminded you that you could endure hardship without breaking. A hand-me-down wasn't just secondhand. It was proof that community mattered more than ego. A quilt made from scraps wasn't just a blanket. It was a monument to creativity in the face of scarcity. What they carried in those garments was a survival code we've largely forgotten. Today, most of us can't even imagine wearing shoes with holes or repairing the same jacket 10 times. We're conditioned to replace, to consume, to discard. But the Depression taught people the opposite. That survival often depends on how much use you can squeeze for what you already have. So, the question is, what would happen if we lived by even a fraction of those lessons today? If we learned to mend instead of discard, will we discover not just thrift, but pride in what we've saved? If we embrace hand-me-downs, could we dissolve some of the pressure to always appear new and instead honor continuity and care? If we turn scraps into warmth, will we begin to see abundance not as buying more, but as creating more from less? These aren't just old habits. They're survival blueprints that could shield us in any time of crisis. And perhaps more importantly, they shift how we see ourselves, not as consumers endlessly reaching for more, but as resilient human beings capable of sustaining life with our own hands. When the Depression forced people to look at clothing and shelter through the lens of survival, it quietly rewired what mattered. And if you're willing to carry even one of those lessons forward, you're not just saving money. You're stepping into the same identity that helped an entire generation endure the harshest years of their lives. They mended, they shared, they repurposed. And because of that, they survived. When we think of survival, most of us imagine food and money first. But during the Great Depression, the battlefield was also inside the home. Utilities, light, heat, water, and cleaning supplies became questions of survival, not convenience. Families weren't just trying to save a few dollars. They were calculating every single moment of light, every drop of water, every ounce of soap. They learned that comfort is a luxury, and that you can live without more of it than you'd ever expect. Imagine this. It's a winter evening in 1932. Outside, the streets are empty. Inside, the living room isn't glowing with light. It's dark except for the flicker of a candle. Children squint to finish homework before the wax burns out. Parents sit in silence, conserving not just electricity, but hope. They knew that every light bulb left on was another penny they didn't have, another meal that might be lost. So they chose the dark, not because they wanted to, but because it was cheaper than survival itself. The harsh lesson? You don't need as much light as you think. They used daylight to the fullest, positioned chairs by windows, and learned that candles and lanterns stretched what little they had. Electricity was no longer an invisible background. It was a decision, and often the answer was no. And it wasn't only light. Water, too, became a form of currency. Today, we turn the tap without thinking. But during the Depression, every drop had a second life. Bath water wasn't drained. It was reused for laundry, scrubbing floors, even watering gardens. Rainwater was collected in barrels, saved for when city supplies were unreliable or too expensive. Gray water, what we call dirty today, wasn't dirty at all. It was resourceful. A bucket of dishwater could clean boots. A rinse tub from laundry could flush a toilet. Nothing was wasted, because waste was the one thing they couldn't afford. Think about the psychology of that. What does it do to you when you're forced to value water like money? It sharpens your sense of what really matters. It teaches you to separate want from needs, indulgence from survival. We've been trained to treat utilities as unlimited as entitlements. They saw them as lifelines. And because they understood scarcity, they practiced a kind of respect for daily essentials we've almost entirely forgotten. And then there's one of the most overlooked truths. If you couldn't buy it, you made it, or you went without. Soap wasn't picked up from a store shelf. It was cooked at home from animal fat and lye. Cleaning supplies weren't branded bottles. They were vinegar, baking soda, and elbow grease. Even candles were sometimes handmade, using scraps of wax or fat. If you didn't know how to craft, you risked going without. And what strikes me most is that this wasn't seen as homesteading chic or some DIY hobby. It was survival. The smell of homemade soap wasn't a choice. It was a difference between hygiene and disease. The rough, scratchy surface of lye soap wasn't pretty, but it worked. Pause for a moment and let that sink in. How much of our modern lifestyle is built on buying convenience rather than building resilience. During the Depression, resilience wasn't optional. A family's ability to make what they needed determined how far their money stretched, how safe their children were, how long they could endure. And that ability came not from wealth, but from ingenuity, from parents teaching children how to stir a pot of soap or how to catch rainwater in a storm, from neighbors trading extra lard for vinegar, from small acts of creativity that, together, kept households alive. This is where the identity shift comes in. Back then, you weren't just a consumer. You were a creator, a fixer, a problem solver. And those identities mattered. They gave people a sense of control in a world where money and jobs had vanished. When the outside world took everything, the home became a workshop of survival. That mindset of refusing to surrender comfort, but instead reinventing it, was a quiet rebellion that carried millions through the darkest years. Now ask yourself, what would happen if we lost these skills completely? What if the lights went out, or water bills doubled, or shelves emptied again? Will we know how to adapt, or will we be paralyzed by dependence? The Depression generation answered that question with their lives. They learned that you can live in the dark and survive. You can reuse water and endure. You can make your own essentials and thrive. And here's the empowering truth. Their lessons aren't locked in past. They're tools we can still pick up. Turning off lights today isn't just saving money. It's practicing discipline. Collecting rainwater isn't just an eco-trend. It's reviving resilience. Making your own soap or cleaners isn't old-fashioned. It's reclaiming self-sufficiency. The same ingenuity that carried them through scarcity can fortify us against uncertainty. The people who lived through the Great Depression discovered that survival wasn't about waiting for conditions to improve. It was about adapting in the present. Every flicker of a candle, every reused drop of water, every bar of homemade soap whispered the same truth. You already have more power than you think. And maybe, just maybe, that's the lesson we need most today. When money dried up during the Great Depression, survival didn't come from bank accounts or paychecks. It came from human ingenuity and the willingness to lean on one another in ways we barely recognize today. Imagine walking through your town with no cash in your pocket, knowing the grocery store shelves are half empty anyway. What would you do? Most of us today would feel trapped, powerless, even humiliated. But back then, people quickly discovered that money was only one way to get what you needed. And when that way failed, they built another system, one rooted in barter, labor, and community trust. Bartering wasn't some fringe idea. It was survival. A farmer might trade a sack of potatoes for a pair of shoes repaired by the cobbler. A seamstress could patch clothing in exchange for eggs or milk. Every skill became a kind of currency, every object a potential trade. And here's the fascinating part. People began to see value differently. What mattered wasn't the brand name, the polish, or even ownership in the traditional sense. What mattered was utility. Can this item help me keep my family warm? Can this skill help me feed them tomorrow? That shift in perspective stripped away the illusions of wealth and forced people to measure life by usefulness rather than appearance. Doesn't it make you wonder how many of the things we buy today would instantly lose their meaning if money collapsed tomorrow? But it wasn't just about trade. It was about labor. Every hand worked, no matter the age. Children weren't sheltered from responsibility. They were part of the survival engine. They fetched water, tended small gardens, or helped mend clothes. Elderly grandparents taught forgotten skills like soap making, canning, or knitting. Parents worked any odd job they could find, hauling wood, scrubbing laundry for wealthier neighbors, or sewing late into the night. Work was not optional, and it was never beneath anyone. Can you imagine the pride that comes from knowing even the youngest or weakest member of your family can contribute to keeping everyone alive? Contrast that with today, where many of us are raised to avoid struggle, to fear work that doesn't come with comfort or prestige. In a sense, the Depression taught families to treat labor not as punishment, but as purpose. And here lies the most powerful truth of all. Community itself became currency. When individuals pooled resources, their collective strength was greater than any single paycheck. One neighbor with a cow could provide milk for several families, while another with carpentry skills could repair homes in exchange for bread. Churches and towns organized share days, where people brought whatever they could, tools, seeds, scraps of fabric, and swapped freely. No one walked away with everything they wanted, but most walked away with at least something they needed. Trust and reciprocity replaced the cold certainty of cash. It was fragile, yes, but it was also profoundly human. Think about how radical that feels compared to our world today. We often live in neighborhoods without ever knowing the people next door. We buy everything in silence, swipe a card, and leave without speaking. But imagine if tomorrow the grid shut down, banks froze accounts, and grocery stores locked their doors. Who would you turn to first? Do you even know if the person across the street could help you, or if you could help them in return? The Depression survivors didn't have the luxury of isolation. They had to trust each other or risk not surviving at all. This is where the lesson becomes uncomfortable. Because while we admire the resourcefulness of barter and community on paper, living it requires sacrifice of pride and independence. It means admitting you can't do everything alone. It means being willing to accept less than perfect in exchange for good enough. And yet, those who made that leap didn't just scrape by. They built bonds so strong they lasted generations. Families remembered who helped them through the hardest winters. Towns carried the memory of who gave when they had little themselves. That legacy wasn't measured in dollars, but in loyalty, dignity, and resilience. So ask yourself, if hardship arrived at your doorstep tomorrow, would you be ready to participate in that kind of system? Do you have a skill that could be traded? Could you swallow your pride enough to knock on a neighbor's door with an offer instead of request? Most of us would hesitate, maybe even resist. But if you study the people who lived through the Depression, you realize they didn't hesitate. They adapted. And by adapting, they discovered something we've nearly forgotten. Survival is not just about enduring the storm. It's about facing it together. That truth might be the harshest lesson of all. Money may fail, systems may collapse, but as long as we are willing to work, to trade, and to trust one another, we are never as powerless as we think. When we think of survival, our minds jump to food, shelter, and warmth. But there's another layer, one that people in the Great Depression understood deeply: the human spirit. You can have bread on the table and a roof over your head, but if hope dries up, survival feels hollow. Back then, most families couldn't afford what we call fun. Yet somehow, they managed to laugh, to play, and create joy out of thin air. That wasn't a luxury. It was a lifeline. Imagine being a child in a home with no radio, no toys from a store, no money for cinema tickets. At first glance, it sounds bleak, but what happened instead was remarkable. Families made their own entertainment. They told stories late into the night, voices weaving worlds that cost nothing but imagination. Children played board games scratched out on cardboard, rolled dice fashioned from wood. Some families pulled out old fiddles or banged rhythms on pots and pans, making music that wasn't polished but was theirs. Lesson 17 was simple but profound. Make your own fun, because joy doesn't come from things. It comes from connection. And isn't that the part we often forget today? We scroll through endless entertainment by gadgets or stream shows, yet how often do we feel truly alive in those moments? The Depression-era families remind us that real fun isn't consumed, it's created. It's sitting with friends and turning conversation into laughter. It's inventing games from nothing and realizing that what makes it memorable isn't the material, but the memory itself. When everything external was stripped away, families discovered the power of presence, and it carried them through. But spirit wasn't just sustained through play. It lived in generosity too. When money disappeared, people didn't stop giving. They just gave differently. Handmade gifts became treasures. A quilt sewn from scraps, a carved wooden toy, a basket of apples from a tree in the yard. Neighbors invited one another to shared meals, not because they had abundance, but because they had enough to stretch if everyone sat together. That was lesson 18. Give what you can, not what you buy. And in some ways, it made the act of giving more meaningful than the store-bought kind. About that contrast. Today, it's easy to feel pressure to spend, to measure love in receipts and price tags. But the families of the Depression proved the opposite, that the truest value comes from effort, thought, and presence, a gift of time, of creativity, of food shared in kindness. Those are the things that can't be bought. And when you practice them, You realize how much stronger and closer they make you feel, not just to others, but to yourself. So the harshest decade of hardship also became, paradoxically, one of deep human joy. Families who had the least discovered they had the most, because spirit was never sold in stores. That's a lesson worth remembering, not just for survival, but for living. When everything else was stripped away during the Great Depression, when jobs disappeared, homes vanished, and entire savings accounts evaporated overnight, there was one truth that stood above all others. Money wasn't just paper. It wasn't just numbers. It was survival itself. And the people who lived through that era came to see money with a fear and reverence that most of us today can barely imagine. Lesson 19 was brutal but unforgettable. Debt was death. Families didn't take loans lightly. They avoided debt as though it carried a plague. Why? Because once you owed, you weren't just borrowing money. You were chaining your future. Banks didn't care if you had nothing left. If you couldn't pay, they took your land, your tools, your home. Imagine working for years to build something for your family and losing it all in a single letter from a creditor. For many, that wasn't imagination. It was Tuesday. People learned to fear debt more than hunger itself. Hunger you could outlast with scraps and gardens. Debt was final. It was the end of your independence, the end of choice, the end of control. Think about the contrast to today. We treat debt almost like oxygen. Credit cards, mortgages, student loans, it's normalized, expected, sometimes even encouraged. But in 1933, borrowing for anything unnecessary was unthinkable. If you didn't have the money, you didn't buy it. If you couldn't pay in cash, you went without. Families passed down a saying, better to eat beans in your own kitchen than steak on someone else's credit. It wasn't about pride. It was about survival. They knew debt meant handing over your future to someone else's ledger, and that was too steep a price. And when you live with that kind of awareness, you develop a second habit that was just as powerful. Lesson 20, budget every penny. This wasn't some casual suggestion to be mindful of your spending. This was a way of life. Every cent was tracked, stretched, and respected. Families would sit down at the table with a pencil and torn scraps of paper, writing out where each coin was going before it left their hands. A nickel had a name. A dime had a purpose. Waste wasn't just frowned upon, it was dangerous. They knew exactly how far a dollar could stretch because they had to. One man might save ticket stubs and receipts to track his week's spending. A mother might keep jars labeled bread, fuel savings, and make sure nothing spilled over. Children grew up learning the cost of sugar, flour, and matches not because it was cute trivia, but because if you didn't understand those numbers, you could make a mistake that left the family short before payday, if there even was one. The discipline wasn't optional. It was survival math. Now here's the uncomfortable question. How many of us today could live with that kind of precision? Could you sit down and assign a purpose to every single dollar before you spent it? Could you cut off credit completely and rely only on what you physically had? Most people can't, and that's the danger. Because if the system buckled tomorrow, the people least prepared will be the ones who treat money like an endless flow. History has already proved what happens when that illusion shatters. The harshest lesson of all was this. Control your money or it will control you. The Depression survivors didn't just learn it, they carved it into their bones. They taught their children to never borrow what they couldn't pay back, to never spend without knowing where the next meal was coming from, and to never take a single dollar for granted. That mindset isn't old-fashioned, it's timeless armor. Because when you strip away everything else, technology, comfort, convenience, the ability to master your money is the difference between barely enduring and truly surviving. These weren't just clever tricks or quaint old habits. They were lifelines. Every single lesson was born out of desperation, yet carried with it a kind of wisdom we've almost forgotten. When you look at them closely, you realize something. These weren't shortcuts. They were survival. They were the difference between going to bed hungry or having something, anything, on the table, between breaking down under the weight of despair or finding a way to laugh together in the dark. And here we are, almost a century later, facing a world that looks far more fragile than we want to admit. Rising prices, shaky economies, systems that promise security but wobble the moment they're stressed. We live with more technology, more convenience, more abundance, But at the same time, most of us have fewer of the skills that carried our grandparents through the storm. Doesn't that strike you as a dangerous trade? The people of the Great Depression didn't just survive because they were tougher. They survived because they learned to control what they could and release what they couldn't. They built their resilience not out of luxury, but out of necessity. And that's the invitation for us today, to stop assuming the world will take care of us and to start taking back responsibility for how we live, spend, and endure. Because the truth is, resilience isn't about stockpiles or survivalist fantasies. It's about mindset. It's about refusing to be owned by debt. It's about finding joy without a price tag. It's about training yourself to make do, to adapt, and to share. That's the real inheritance of those who came before us. The power to endure what feels impossible and to come out the other side stronger, not weaker. So ask yourself, which of these lessons hit you hardest? Was it the fear of debt, the creativity of making your own fun, or the sheer discipline of tracking every penny? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear what resonated most with you. And if you found value here, hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs a reminder that history isn't just about the past. It's a manual for surviving the future. Stay wise, stay frugal, and never forget to keep finding joy in simplicity.